They escaped the horrors of war in their country, but millions of refugees from Sudan now face the risk of hunger. The United Nations World Food Programme is facing a dire shortage of funds. Who's to blame and who might step in to feed the refugees? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. The World Food Programme has sounded the alarm, saying it may have to reduce its aid operations for Sudanese refugees because of cutbacks in its funding. 4 million refugees are in countries neighbouring Sudan after fleeing from the ongoing civil war, and most of them rely on aid. But that was put in jeopardy after the Trump administration slashed overseas aid budgets earlier this year. The European Union, the UK and Germany have also cut funding for foreign aid as some nations switch funding to invest in defence. So who else can step in and fill the gap? Should the US be responsible to a large degree for the budgets of international aid organisations? And what will happen to the people who depend on aid to survive? We'll put these questions to our guests in a moment, but first Imogen Kimber has our report.
The World Food Programme says funding cuts will force it to reduce or even stop its distribution of aid to Sudanese refugees within months. More than 4 million people have fled the civil war in Sudan, going to neighbouring countries Chad, Egypt, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Uganda and Ethiopia. Most are facing severe hunger and lack access to basic services. Many rely entirely on the WFP for their survival. Some are already receiving less aid than they need. In Uganda, people are surviving on a quarter of what they need every day to survive. Around 9 million people are internally displaced inside Sudan, and around 24.6 million people don't have enough food to eat. WFP has been scaling up its efforts to reach around 4 million of them. The organisation has been raising the alarm for a while.
Over the next few months, we're very concerned about the reduction in humanitarian funding, which will lead to a decline in assistance. That means smaller rations and reduced numbers of people receiving much-needed humanitarian assistance in some of the world's most vulnerable countries.
And the UN's Office for Humanitarian Affairs says they're being forced to make tough choices.
6 months ago, we launched a ruthlessly prioritised humanitarian appeal to help some of the most vulnerable people on the planet. Today, we're having to prioritise even further. We're having to hyper-prioritise. Brutal funding cuts have left us with the cruel math of doing less with less. Even as the world around us remains on fire, and as people die because we don't have the resources to save them.
The reduction in funding is due to the Trump administration cutting the US aid budget at the beginning of the year. The US provided around half of the WFP's funding, along with supporting many other aid agencies.
There are millions of lives on the line as a result of aid cuts. As you know, the President proposed in his budget an 84% reduction in the aid and diplomacy budget of the US government, more than $8 out of $10 being removed from the budgets.
But the US is not alone. Other countries have also made cuts in aid budgets, including the EU, Germany and the UK. Many are using the money to invest in defence, something the US has pushed them to do, saying they need to take greater care of their own security. The UN says the civil war in Sudan has displaced more people than in any other country. It describes Sudan as the world's forgotten crisis and says it needs more money now before it's too late. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's first bring in our guest, Carl Skau, the UN World Food Programme's Deputy Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer. He joins us today from London. I want to talk to you about the situation in Sudan and in neighbouring countries. We're now at the point 2 years and 2 months of war in Sudan. How bad are things?
Well, things are really bad. The war rages on. About 24 million people are still in need of humanitarian assistance, and 10 million of them acutely food insecure. So it's the largest humanitarian disaster we have in the world. At the same time, over the past couple of months, we have been able to make some progress in terms of delivering to people. WFP alone has been delivering to some 5 million people per month this spring, and that's up from 1.52 million only last year. So there is some progress, and we are back in Khartoum, we are back in large parts of Darfur, and so there is progress. Now the big issue is, can we sustain this? Is the funding there for such a big operation? And then obviously we're extremely concerned about the situation in Al-Fasher, where 300,000 people have been trapped now for over a year.
I've seen reports of people who are eating grass, people eating leaves. Do you believe currently there are people starving to death in Sudan?
I do. I mean, last year, famine was confirmed in 10 hotspots. We have about 1 million people in the highest category of IPC, which is how we determine food insecurity, which means that they are in starvation. There is no doubt. Malnutrition among children has skyrocketed, and those are conditions that children die from if that's left unattended.
When you look at the displacement figures, they are quite staggering. This is a country of 50 million people, and we have about 13 million who have been forced out of their homes. I think that's equivalent to the entire population of Belgium. How are neighbouring countries coping?
Of those 13 million displaced, this is the largest displacement crisis to start off with in the world right now, and 4 million of those 13 million have also left Sudan and are now in the neighboring countries. Some countries like Chad is hosting 1 million refugees. Early on, these people came with nothing. They were already malnourished. They were basically just carrying the clothes they had on. And so we were able to step up and assist them early on in the crisis, also working with local communities. And, we need to here also recognize and commend the hosting governments and countries. But right now, funding is running really short. In countries like Uganda, we have had to cut this assistance to 1/4 if we compare only to a few months ago. And in Chad, again, hosting 1 million refugees, we're about to start our cuts. And so this will not only have a humanitarian impact on these refugees who have nowhere to turn, it will also have a destabilizing impact on the entire region.
So do you expect you're going to have to make further cuts in the coming months? How severe is your funding crisis currently?
Overall, we have a 40% cut in our funding. And some operations, like the one in Uganda, has really been hit hard. And so, yes, we are already doing serious cuts where we are basically taking from the hungry to give to the starving. But in refugee context, there is a little bit different, because these are often people who live in camps. They have nothing else to turn to. Returning is not an option when it comes to Sudan. Integrating to the local community is often not allowed for. And so, there are only very negative coping mechanisms if people are not provided the basics. And the food is really the basic need. You either starve or you have to move on. Those are the two. Or you turn to negative coping mechanisms, including, joining armed groups or terrorist groups. So yes, the situation is dire, and we hope that the international will heed our calls and step up with more funding coming forward.
You talk about the international community, but isn't the main problem the United States? I looked at your figures from last year. You received, to carry out your work globally, $9.7 billion. About half of that, $4.4 billion, came from the United States. Is the US cuts, are they the main problem? And if that's the case, are people in Sudan, you say they're dying, are they dying because of Trump's funding cuts?
WFP, the US has been particularly generous to WFP over the years. So as you said, in a way, WFP is particularly vulnerable to cuts when it comes from the US side. But I think when we look at our 40% cut overall, it's not only the US, it's also coming from Europe. And so, it is a cut across the board. And we are actively looking at what we call diversifying our funding base, look to other government, looks to private sector. But that's not going to tap the shortfall that we're now seeing, because it's very fast and it's very dramatic. So yes, we need some time to adapt here, and we're trying to find ways to do so.
When you look at those other countries that are funding you, I mean, the big ones after the US, and the US is by far the biggest, Germany, the UK, and the European Union. Do you think some of these countries are cutting their funds because they've been given political cover because the US is doing it?
Well, I think there are a mix of reasons. Last week in The Hague, governments met and committed to a 5% target on defense. And I think that is obviously pushing out a lot of other priorities. At the moment, we've heard some government, explaining their cuts on aid because of their investments in defense. I mean, our argument is that, it's not one or the other. There is certainly need to continue to invest in food security. Food security are often causes of conflict, but they're also drivers of conflict and instability. And so, there is also, beyond the humanitarian imperative, a need to continue to invest in people having the basics to promote stability around the world.
Coming back to the United States, it was the biggest funder for all humanitarian assistance in Sudan. Doesn't the biggest economy in the world have a moral duty to be doing more? And will you be trying to persuade the US to try and restore some of the funding?
Well, the US has done a lot, and it continues to be a generous donor. There is certainly enough money out there for people not to starve. And so I think we hope there will be a coalition of willing stepping forward to cover some of the gaps, and so that we can continue our operations and frankly, provide the necessary assistance. I think Tom Fletcher, the emergency relief coordinator, referenced a number last week that 1% of all defense spending is what we're asking for to sustain our humanitarian operations. That shouldn't be an impossible task to mobilize that 1%.
Carl Skau, Deputy Executive Director of the UN World Food Programme, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, let's discuss all of this further now with our panel of guests. Joining us today from Somerville, Massachusetts, Alex de Waal is Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation. And from London, Khulud Khair is a political analyst and founding director at Confluence Advisory, a think tank. Thank you both for joining us. You heard there, the two of you, Carl Skau. Alex, he's a very experienced diplomat. He was being very diplomatic. Let me put the same question I put to him to you. Are Sudanese people dying because of the Trump administration's funding cuts?
There's a simple answer, and the answer is yes. Not only has the funding been cut, but many organizations were actually on contract to deliver specific services and had put money up front in order to deliver those. And then they were, as it were, cut off at the knees. Not only their funding stopped, but the money they'd already spent was not to be reimbursed. And it's not just World Food Programme. Perhaps the most effective form of humanitarian assistance in Sudan was the money given to local organizations, local NGOs, the emergency response rooms, and the US was the largest donor to those. And that money has now gone.
Khulud, let me get your take on this. The US says it's still providing aid to Sudan. Do we have a clear picture of how much money it is giving and whether that money or whatever it's doing is in any way effective?
There is no clear picture, and I doubt even the US administration can currently give you a clear picture because they've fired everyone who could. The problem is that they sort of got rid of USAID, the International Agency for US Agency for International Development, before they could come up with an alternative. And now much of what the US is saying it will provide through, in terms of humanitarian assistance, will be provided through the State Department, which is an entity that doesn't have great experience sort of administering large volumes of aid. So from the side of those receiving the money, either on the ground or in the UN, they have no sense of what comes next because there's no one to talk to. And initially, that was the confusion in February when the stop work order came in that led to a huge dip in aid and lots of community kitchens in Sudan to close up and lots of clinics to effectively dry up in terms of medication. Now there's some sort of return with the money that had been promised petering through. But the question then becomes what happens after September? September is sort of the cutoff date for USAID programs that are currently in motion and the money that's already been committed to be spent. What happens after that? No one knows.
Alex, you were right to mention there's much more than WFP, but you were the author of a book, Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine. Let me just dwell on WFP for a moment, because I do think it's notable that the US has always played a huge role in WFP. In many ways, they sort of run that agency. The current boss of WFP is Cindy McCain. Carl Skau, who we heard from, is her deputy. She's an American. And the previous 5 holders of that post were American. And most, or at least half the money comes from the US.
This has always been the case, as you say, since the organisation was set up. And there are many criticisms of it, including its domination by the US, its general orientation to US foreign policy priorities. That said, no one has stepped into the gap. And Carl Skau mentioned the Europeans, who are the sort of second tier of donors, who also have been scaling back, so that we still have the astonishing fact that in Sudan, of the while only 14% of the amount that the UN identifies as needed for Sudan this year, only 14% has thus far actually been pledged. The US is still the largest donor. But the really shocking thing is that there are countries close to Sudan that are awash with money. And I'm thinking of the United Arab Emirates. I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, also Qatar, that in many cases have a direct role in this war, and they have no shortage of money, and they are not stepping into this gap. And that's something that is not being called out with anything like the volume that is required.
Khulud, just give us a picture from what you're hearing about how bad the humanitarian situation is now in Sudan. We've passed the 2-year mark of this war. Things are getting worse, not better, yeah?
Things are getting precipitously worse, and the issue is that we're now entering the lean season, which is the planting season and the rainy season, and we're expecting some sort of harvest at the end of the rainy season around September, October, early November, and by all indicators, that's going to be another failed harvest. And actually, the best way to really counter a famine is not through large volumes of international aid, effective as though that may be. It is in ensuring that harvests are, successful to the fullest extent, and that is harvest across different varieties of produce, in particular different types of grain. Now, in Sudan, what we have seen is that while there are some areas, for example, in the Sudanese army areas that are able to produce for example, wheat, not much of that actually ends up coming into markets, and people in those areas are still starving. A lot of it is imported and therefore is used to buy guns. And this is, I think, the issue that is really going to be massively exacerbating the famine that we're already seeing. Now, Carl Skau mentioned that there were 10 famine areas, local groups that say that there are many more areas in famine conditions. And we're seeing young people, particularly babies, starve. We're seeing malnutrition affect children, not just in terms of hunger, but also in terms of comorbidities or other kinds of, ailments. We're seeing older people particularly impacted by hunger and starvation. We're seeing children who have gone beyond the point of being able to simply recover by eating food and are in need of what is called plum peanut, that is a mostly peanut-based supplement that is given to children. And even that is not available. A lot of it is actually in warehouses in the United States that, because of the stop work order in February, have not been given permission to be released. So this is, an issue that is compounded not just by the dynamics that are happening in country, but also globally as well, particularly which has already been promised from the largest humanitarian provider, the United States.
Alex, reading between the lines what we're hearing from the UN and particularly from WFP, it seems that they're going to try and prioritise assistance to those in Sudan, if they can reach them. And that the cuts are coming to the refugees in neighbouring countries first, at least. Do you think that's given the lack of funding they have, do you think that's the best thing they can do?
There's no right answer to this. I mean, as you will see or hear from those senior aid officials. The technical term, what they're doing is triage, and triage is abandoning those who cannot be saved because the resources are not there to give them the life-saving care and assistance that is needed. And the tragedy of this, amongst many of the tragedies, is that in just giving enough food to people to keep them alive where you can, people are forced to sell their last possessions, to abandon their homes, to consume the seeds that they need to plant, to sell their last goats and sheep, which might produce milk or be a future livelihood. So the needs will stack up, and the recovery, if it comes, will be that much slower and more difficult.
Khulud, should there not be more of an international outcry about what's going on in Sudan and about this lack of funding? And do you think us, the international media, are partly to blame? This should be in people's living rooms. People should know about this.
The answer is yes and yes. I mean, the media has a huge part to play here in terms of how much attention Sudan is getting. And we frankly haven't seen enough. I mean, particularly in the English language space, I think, aside from your channel, very few channels cover it with any great deal of regularity. And, when I ask various journalists or various publishers and editors why not, they say, well, it's not really much of a priority, for example, for people in the West. To which, of course, I reply, well, make it one. Because people frankly don't know the details. When I speak to people, sometimes even people within the neighboring countries around Sudan, they don't know just how bad things are. They just know that they have a lot of refugees. So more and better coverage of Sudan is desperately needed. But, those who administer governments, those who make decisions, are not waiting for news channels to tell them what's going on in Sudan. They have their own ways of getting information about what's going on in Sudan. They're just choosing to deprioritize it. For example, in terms of defense funding, we're seeing that the world is spending $2.7 trillion on weapons, on defense, and very, very little on aid, very, very little on peacekeeping. So it's not a question of there being no resources. It's absolutely a question of being where that money is being spent. And yes, the US is making large cuts, but Europe is also partially here in terms of its commitments, partially to blame also for reducing some of its commitments previously made. But as Alex rightly said, next door to us in Sudan, there are countries with vast amounts of wealth that are very much involved in this war, that are very much driving this war. And they have vast sums of money that are not being tapped. And frankly, that's because no one is expecting them to pay this money. But when they do, as in the case of the United Arab Emirates, oftentimes they use that as sort of aid washing when they've been accused of committing crimes or supporting the genocide in Darfur. They will give the UN, small amounts of money here and there, 1 million, 10 million, etc. Vastly different to the amounts of money that they are accused of spending in terms of funding the war. And so there has to be, these countries need to be required to pay at least a fair share towards this response. Otherwise, we are effectively sacrificing the children of Sudan at the altar of geopolitics.
Alex, before we end our discussion, I think it might be useful to get a little bit of context. In your assessment, who, if anyone, is winning this war? Because we saw the Sudanese army take control of the capital in March. In many conflicts, that's a decisive moment. It doesn't seem to be in this conflict, though.
Everyone is losing in this war. Every now and then, one side or the other, the army or the rapid support forces, will announce a victory. But immediately or a few days later, what we see is any military or political momentum they may have had then runs into the sand. And the war is becoming an intractable conflict that is just grinding down the Sudanese people beyond the point of desperation.
So, Khulud, do you see any hope for diplomacy, any efforts that could lead to a political solution? And this may be a controversial question. Could the best answer for now be some sort of partition?
Well, if we look at previous examples of partition in Sudan, that's never played out very well. I mean, if you look at South Sudan, the problems in South Sudan were not, simply fixed through partition. So I don't think that history shows us that that's the right way to go. And also, Sudan's problems are interlinked, despite the very many attempts to split Sudan apart, both internally and externally. Sudan, the fate of Sudanese people is intertwined because Sudanese people broadly want the same things. They want to be able to live free. They want to be able to, live away from military rule and be able to have livelihoods, etc. What we're seeing now is that, people across the world are only starting to, put faith in any kind of political process, because the Egyptian process has stalled, the AU process has stalled, and really the only thing that we've seen in terms of international attention is the Americans hinting that after the deal that they struck between Rwanda and the DRC, they're looking towards Sudan next. Of course, previously there was that meeting with the UAE, Saudi, and Egyptian ambassadors in Washington, D.C. But this is not a strategy. This is not any concrete sign that the world is willing to pay attention, with or without American leadership, to getting a political resolution in Sudan. So where is the hope? The hope is in the people that are right now at the front line of delivering aid to people, despite the repressive tactics that they're facing from the warring generals and the other militias, and despite the aid cuts that are being inflicted upon them from the world's richest countries. That's where the hope lies.
Alex, what do you think is the best hope or the best strategy going forwards?
Well, I think on this issue, we have to recognise, first and foremost, famine is a crime. This is not a natural disaster. This is a crime inflicted by Sudanese generals and their backers on the Sudanese people. And as with any crime of this nature, the first responsibility falls on those who committed it to ameliorate the ills, the sufferings, to provide reparations. And I think we need to think of it in this way, and to get away from what we are seeing at the moment, which is all sorts of tactical positioning about who has gained from the war and therefore who should gain from the peace. We don't want to see a peace deal that is, as it were, just the annex to a business deal in which the wealth of Sudan is divided up amongst those who have been preying on the Sudanese people.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you to our guests today, Alex de Waal and Khulud Khair. If you want to know more about the situation in Sudan, you'll find plenty of context and analysis. You can visit our website, aljazeera.com. We want to hear your views too. Go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. I'll see you back here very soon. Until then, from me, James Bays, and all the team here, please stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Don't miss out, get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.